This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with comic artist Peter Bagge, author of the new collection of comic journalism, Everybody is Stupid Except for Me, and Other Astute Observations. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Peter Bagge is the creator of the comic series Hate, which chronicles the life of Gen X slacker Buddy Bradley, as well as Neat Stuff, Sweatshop, and Apocalypse Nerd. But his new collection, Everybody is Stupid Except for Me and Other Astute Observations, brings together the comics he created originally for the Libertarian magazine Reason. Peter, welcome back to the program.
Hi, thanks.
Now, we talked a bit about your libertarianism last time, but I think what's important to get out here for this conversation is because people tend to define their own sort of personal libertarianism differently, what do you say to someone who, say, gets it third hand that you're a libertarian, doesn't know much or anything about politics, and asks you, so what is this libertarianism?
How would I answer that question?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, basically it means having as limited a government as is possible, and just giving people more freedom or more responsibility for their own lives. And of course, that is what varies greatly from person to person. People who define themselves as libertarian, they could range anywhere from an anarchist or close or something that they call anarcho-capitalist, which is a anarchist that still believes in private property. So you can go from there all the way to, say, a civil libertarian, which is basically a liberal who's very much in favor of freedom of speech and things of that nature, but still is a little bit, it doesn't give too much when it comes to property rights and things of that nature.
And so what stripe of libertarianism do you place yourself in?
Well, socially, I'm pretty liberal. Amongst libertarians, too, there's just like with the rest of the country, there's still that cultural divide, that so-called red state, blue state divide, where, some libertarians are, if they're from a rural area, they still... they're still church-going. If they have to vote, if they feel like they have to vote for a Republican or a Democrat, they'll vote Republican. Whereas I'm the opposite. I'm one of those white wine sipping urban effete types. If I'm the opposite, where if I feel like I've got to vote for a Democrat or Republican, I almost always vote for a Democrat. And again, it's for the social reasons.
They call that a cocktail party libertarian, don't they?
There you go, yes.
And so is that also the libertarian climate of Reason magazine, for those who don't know it? I mean, where do they fall as an organization?
Yeah, for the most part, because Reason magazine is published by the Reason Foundation, which is a pretty large foundation. I've only met a handful of people who work for the foundation. But the mere fact that the foundation is based in Los Angeles and the magazine is based in Washington, D.C., right there tells you that they don't have too many employees driving pickup trucks with shotgun racks on the back. But yet the people who contribute to the foundation, since they're a nonprofit foundation and they rely on, for the most part, on people donating money to them, that still covers all kinds. So you've got lots of very God-fearing types who made a lot of money in oil or ranching who give money to Reason. It seems like they sometimes hold their nose while they do it, but they do it anyway.
If there's anything I've gotten from looking at all your work that I've read as a whole, maybe I'm wrong about this, but you do seem to have a strong interest in subcultures and kind of depicting representative members of those subcultures. Now, is libertarianism itself, do you consider that to be a rich subculture for examination?
No, and that is because in their day-to-day lives, libertarians tend not to flock together because, again, when you say that, it doesn't at all represent where you're coming from culturally. The only thing that all people who would define themselves that way have in common is that they wish that government was smaller, had a smaller role in our lives. And even that varies greatly. But whether that or not that means you live in, as I was just saying, whether that means you live in the country or the city or the suburbs, or if you go to church or you don't go to church, there's no type. You can't generalize libertarians in that way at all. And because of that, and they do all different kinds of things for a living, you have libertarians who work in government, although an awful lot of them are also self-employed. And again, just being self-employed means you're not all gathered in the same place. So people are very far afield. It tends to be certain political events, and then there's the Libertarian Party, which doesn't even represent everybody. But at Libertarian Party events, that's one of the few times you'll see a whole bunch of libertarians gathered in one place.
It is actually kind of a rarity now that I think about it. With the libertarians, or the people that I know who call themselves libertarian, and the Libertarian Party, there's really no overlap. I don't know any libertarian who also happens to be a party member. What's going on there, do you think?
Boy, that's a tough one to answer. The problem with the Libertarian Party is, even though our country wasn't designed this way, it is in effect a two-party system. So it's extremely rare that somebody who's running on the Libertarian Party ticket is going to get elected. So it's always a protest vote. I do the same thing. If I feel like, well, it's very easy for me here in Seattle, which is overwhelmingly Democratic. It's very easy for me to cast my vote for any libertarian that's running, just to let people know that they're there and that there are people who agree with libertarian candidates. You know, I have no fear that by voting for I have no fear ever that by voting for a libertarian that I risk doing a Ralph Nader and wind up giving the election to a Republican. That's just out of the question here in Seattle. In fact, I think the Green Party and maybe even the Libertarian Party at this point gets more votes in Seattle proper than the Republican Party does.
Wow, that's surprising. I used to live around there. I didn't realize things were heading so far in that direction.
Yeah, it's getting extremely polarized between where Democrats and Republicans live. They seem to be fleeing from each other.
It reminds me of a panel in one of these comics in the book where you quote somebody at an event as saying, well, you know, forget Seattle. They've committed too many sins already. It's an even race outside of Seattle. And I'm thinking, wow, it really has gotten bad.
Right.
I suppose I should go back a little bit, actually, and say, I do understand that these Comics for Reason are a bit of an extension of work you had done for the now defunct online magazine Suck. So what was the transition there? With
Suck, the difference in format was what I wrote for them was mostly text, and then it would be heavily illustrated. So, and occasionally the illustrations would have, well, I suppose they almost always had some word balloons in them, but they were predominantly text pieces that I profusely illustrated. And then when I started working for Suck, the format changed so that it was comic strips. And originally for Reason, well, I'm sorry, I should back up. I think I made a slip there. When I started working for Reason, it was comic strips. And at first it was one-page comic strips, but then it slowly evolved where I only was doing the 4-page features. And those 4-page features are modeled after a strip I did 10 or so years ago for Details magazine. Details magazine, for a while, under the auspices of Art Spiegelman, the guy that wrote that Mouse graphic novel, he came up with the idea of having Details send out a different cartoonist each month to act as a cartoon journalist. They would send him to some event, and he or she would come back with a 4-page strip based on that event, reporting on the event. So I did something like that for Details, and the managing editor of Reason at the time really liked that format. He thought it was very effective. So he had me doing the same thing on a regular basis.
Now, cartoon journalism, as we'll call it, was that the first instance you had done of that Details piece?
Yes, it was.
And was that like when you realized what you were doing was essentially a new direction isn't the word I'm looking for, but it's just kind of a new way of using cartoons, at least in your career up to that point? Was it like, wow, this is going to be a great challenge, or like, oh, crap, what do I do?
Well, it was, and it remains a challenge in that I'm always struggling with how much text should, even in a comic strip format, they're still very text-heavy. And so I always struggle with how much of it is text as opposed to trying to convey a lot of information with the artwork, with drawings. Because it's easier, it's much easier to report using straight text. That's what people have almost always done, and still do. So it's much easier to do it that way, and then maybe, like I was doing with Suck, to just write a straight text piece and then pepper it with drawings. But then to try to turn it into a comic strip, that's the big struggle, is how to still say everything that you want to say and share all the information that you think it's important to share with the reader, but also not make each panel just bogged down with words.
And now, in what ways have you learned how to more effectively do that, starting from the days of details and moving on? There must have been countless lessons just from the process.
Yeah, I still haven't learned. It's still a real struggle, and it's basically and this has been a problem with me in general, is trying to be more concise, just trying to pare down the words while still not losing anything, while still saying everything that I want to say. So that is what is always the struggle, is just boiling down the text to its essence. And I still feel like I never succeed in doing that. I still always feel like there's too many words there. And occasionally editors will help me in that regard, although they also will do the opposite. I'll tell them that more than anything else, when I'm working with an editor, whether it's with Reason or anybody else, what I always tell them is, the type of help I'd really appreciate is if you could help me boil down the word count. If you read a sentence and you could see that sentence being cut in half somehow and still getting the gist across, that would be great. More often than not, the editors do the opposite. They'll be like, well, what about this? And you didn't talk about this guy, and blah, 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 blah. And they wind up encouraging me just to make it more verbose.
Now, I want to know more about there's a sort of a famed fastidiousness of the Reason editors that I'll ask about soon, but I do wonder that, did you ever get the impression, though, that maybe your fans really like the wordiness, maybe isn't the word, but they like the volume of text you've managed to work into your comics?
Well, I certainly don't get many complaints, but I always wonder if when somebody who's not necessarily a fan of mine or even a comic fan, I always worry and wonder that when they take their first glance at one of my comics, that possibly the wordiness of it turns them off completely. They don't get past the first page just because it's so verbose. I don't know how I would ever know that. I'd have to focus group a group of people to find out if that's a problem or not. It obviously isn't a problem with some people, but I always wonder if I lose some potential readers just because of the wordiness of it.
Now, when you were originally brought on to do some comics for Reason, was it that they had some ideas for you, like these are the kind of events or situations we really want to see Peter Bagge draw and write about, or was it like, we want your ideas? Well, with Reason, the way it works, occasionally, not too often, but occasionally they would make some suggestions, or there might even be, I can't think offhand what it would be, but there may have been certain events that they specifically wanted me to cover. But for the most part, with Reason, the way it always worked was I would make a handful of suggestions, and they would pick one. They seemed to like me to give them a choice, and then they would say, well, this particular idea sounds good. And very often it would be based on something coming up, especially in Seattle, so that we could all save on travel expenses. If there was anything going on in my area that I could go and cover, that would always be a good thing. But again, occasionally too, like I think the last feature I did for them in that book was covering the 2008 New Hampshire primaries. And I think there was a Libertarian event coinciding with the primaries, so I went and covered both, and that just seemed
but because of the two of them, that seemed like a bit of a no-brainer on both my part and theirs. With Suck Magazine, interestingly, that Suck.com website that preceded Reason, the editors there, they almost always had their own idea. They almost always just would call me up and tell me, we would like to send you to the Miss America pageant or the Indy 500. Those type of events is always what intrigued them, and they would just tell me, this is what you're doing. Well, I could have said no, but I always said yes because events like that fascinate me too.
Now, whether you're going to the New Hampshire primaries or a Libertarian event or the Miss America competition, when you're collecting material to work into a piece of comics journalism, is this more a matter, has it been more a matter for you of experiencing as much as you can and then getting that into a comics format, or are you consciously thinking to yourself, what is going to look good or amusing or interesting in a comics format, and I should gravitate toward that, if that makes any sense?
Going into it, I learned very quickly not to assume an angle. Or, if I go to an event, for example, just to be obvious, let's say Miss America, it's a huge mistake for me to think, okay, I already know what I'm going to say about this whole thing. I already know what I think. And then to go there and try to make sure that everything that I see or write about fits into that preconceived notion, that always is a mistake. If you do that, you're constantly trying to pound square pegs into round holes. You just can't do it. Or you can, but it would be crap.
Yeah, people are doing it all the time. It's no good.
I know, it's terrible. So I already know to go with a blank slate. Sometimes a story thread might begin to take shape almost right away, but that's pretty rare. So basically what I do is I try to take in as much as I can. I try to watch as much as I can, too. Like, I'll do some interviewing, of course, and just small talking with people. But for the most part, I really just like to try to be invisible and eavesdrop and just watch what's going on and watch the way people interact with each other and just take notes. I draw doodles and just take lots of notes, and occasionally, and again, like a Miss America pageant, I'm going back to a very obvious example. I went into it thinking it's going to be really stupid. I just assumed I would hate every aspect of it, but the exact opposite happened. I didn't enjoy it to the point that I became a pageant fiend. It didn't interest me enough that I wanted to ever go back to one, but I did enjoy it, and I really didn't find anything about it to condemn. I wound up having no problem with both the pageant and the people who are into it. It's just their own thing, and I came to the conclusion that it's utterly harmless and kind of fun, and if you like it, that's great, and if you don't, then stop sweating over it and worrying about it. But I also, in that piece, if I remember correctly, I also commented on the fact that I went in with a snot-nosed punk attitude and more or less made fun of myself right away. I was had this almost adolescent boy attitude when I first went there, where I remember doodling some of the people in the pageant and deliberately making them look stupid, And then I would talk, I would be doodling one of the contestants and making her look like an idiot. And then I'd talk to her later and realize not only was she very smart, she was very intelligent, and nice. And so I suddenly felt like a complete idiot for what I did.
It does seem that purely the aesthetics of a Miss America pageant, though, they are pretty ripe for being caricatured.
They are, but the thing is, the contestants, most of them, at least it might be different in other pageants, but in this pageant, most of the contestants that I talked to were very aware of the hokiness of it, the outdatedness of it. At least on some level, all of them were there for the money. They get scholarship money. Just for attending, they get some, and then if they win, they get even more. Or if they're a finalist, they get more. But they're all there for the scholarship money. And that's something that, at least with that pageant, again, it might not be true with all of them, but with like, what is the one that Donald Trump runs?
Oh, yes. The name
Miss
escapes
Universe,
me. I think that's it.
I don't know what it is. But it seems like they almost seem like they get a lot of mileage out of the fact that the women are dim bulbs. That seems to be what the publicity is always about, is if one of the contestants says something dumb, it's always in the press the next day. And they still make a big deal out of looks, appearances, because that's what gets the ratings. The Miss America pageant can't even get on TV anymore because they're putting so much emphasis over talent and intelligence than looks. The women I talked to, they were cringing over the whole bathing suit competition. They were really embarrassed about that, and they're going to Stanford and Harvard and Yale. They were a lot smarter than I was.
Yikes! It's always a little bit. I don't know how quite to put it, but it's disorienting when you find that the participants in an event widely regarded as hokey also think that it's hokey. I mean, that's not the first time that's happened in your journalism, has it?
No, but it's they're not crazy. Like I said, they're not stupid. They're fully aware of what's going on, and they can't hate it that much. They must not hate it that much, or they wouldn't do it. It's not like they live on another planet and they come back down to Earth only to be in a pageant. They have eyes and ears, and they know how most people perceive these things these days. It's a bit, especially the Miss America pageant, it's a bit of an anachronism. And to see it there in Atlantic City is just, which is an anachronistic city itself.
True.
Yeah, it's all so odd.
This issue of trying to go in without an angle and changing your mind about something as you are gathering information to report on it, this brings up an issue that I think all journalists face every now and again, or maybe perpetually throughout their careers, is how much to write what might be thought of as quote-unquote objective journalism, and how much to involve oneself and one's own perspective, describing your own change of mind. Is that a sort of a pendulum swing you've done yourself, or has it seems like you do include yourself, and to good effect?
Yes, and they want the editors of Reason insist that I always include myself. I would have myself appear even less if I was left to my own devices, but they liked me as the starring character. And the other thing, too, is these pieces were never strict reporting. I was not being just a straight reporter. I was reporting, but I also was commenting. I was also editorializing on everything I was seeing. And so in that regard, there was no pretense at being objective. I would try to be objective and only to be fair, and to be honest for the most part. But then the whole point, too, was that I would if I do wind up coming with an opinion, that I would share it and express it and explain why.
Now, do you find it harder, or do you think you would find it harder to achieve some sort of objectivity, as we've called it, or to be completely honest about yourself? Which one is actually the tougher hill to climb?
Well, that's just it. I don't understand how anybody can separate those two.
Right, right.
That seems impossible. To be true to yourself, but also because the whole point of reporting objectively is describing what you see. But I guess what you then have to do is avoid passing judgment. Boy, it's got to be really tough. To what extent do you expect a black reporter to be objective at a KKK rally? To be super obvious, you know what I mean?
Right.
Or to expect again, to take another obvious example, a reporter from Ms. Magazine interviewing Hugh Hefner. Is she really going to be? Is the piece and herself going to be totally objective from beginning to end? It's crazy not to expect that reporter not to have a certain angle, because they always do.
It's a fair point. I always think to myself, I'd much rather have every angle, every bias be clear and present, rather than have the pretense of there being no angles and no bias, if that makes any sense. Right,
because it just simply always is. The same as if some event happens in the Middle East, you'll pick up an Israeli newspaper, and they might all think they might be convinced, every single person working for that newspaper might be convinced that their reporting on the event is completely objective, and then you'll hear the same thing reported in an Arab newspaper, and you would think that you're reading about two different events, but both sides think that they're being completely objective.
And now I guess I have to ask you this, because of the direction we've been going in. If you are reading, or if you're listening to, if you're watching media sources that are more known as libertarian, ones you're more inclined to agree with, I mean, do you think to yourself there's ever a libertarian bias that even a libertarian must find a way to correct for?
Yeah, there is a libertarian bias, and that's something that I almost always have, although the conclusions that I draw don't always adhere strictly to the libertarian playbook, assuming there could be such a thing. Not everybody that reads Reason magazine, including my own editors, always agree with all of my conclusions. They do for the most part, but not always. But yes, of course, because that's where I'm coming from. That's the whole reason that Reason asked me to do this for them. You know, if I didn't generally share their political worldview, they never would have asked me to do comics for them.
Of the pieces in this book, what then are the ones that have been received as being the biggest break from the libertarian playbook? Let's assume there is one. I mean, are there any that people have said, wait, no libertarian would say X, Y, and Z?
Well, something I'm ashamed to say caused a huge split in libertarian circles was the Iraq War. And I still, to this day, cannot believe that any self-described libertarian could have supported that for a single second. I'm still flabbergasted that was the case, but I can't give you any statistics, but it seemed like at least half of them bought into that crap, or completely bought into all that lies, and that all of a sudden, for the first time ever, they believed in nation building and et cetera, et cetera. It just floored me. Again, it's interesting as how easily people could be swayed from even their own political views, you know, and it's all because of 9/11. They were completely manipulated by the Bush administration into buying into something that normally they never would have buy into, and it was all because of the way we all overreacted so shamelessly to 9/11. So the few pieces where I did report on the war, of course, there were libertarians that supported. I'm sure most of them have changed their minds since then. I hope so. Other than that, there's none that jumps out. There's no feature that jumps out where a lot of Reason readers disagreed with me. The one where I thought I would have caught some flack was the story I did about homeless people. It was called Bums.
Yes.
Because while reporting that, but all of my life, I myself never quite knew what the best way was to tackle this problem. A purely libertarian view would be to do nothing, you know, that let them fend for themselves, figure it out. If charities and individuals want to help them out, by all means, go ahead, but it's not the role of government to house these people. In reporting this, I talked to people who did get some government funds, but who I also thought, it seemed to me, had some good ideas. That was a really tricky one, writing that one. The reason it seems like, or the reason I came to the conclusion that it is up to the public, even if that means government agencies have to do something about, and we're talking about the chronically homeless. You know, I'm about talking about because, again, and I talk about that in the strip, people, depending on what their agenda is, they really play fast and loose with homeless statistics. You know, because we've all known somebody who was between jobs or not knowing what to do with their lives, and sometimes by choice was living in their car or couch surfing at their friend's house. And to some folks, that they technically qualify as homeless. Or all the women who might be in a battered women's shelter, they technically, depending on how you want the statistics to read, they technically are homeless. But most people who fall into that category, they generally are homeless for an average of 6 months, and they also generally are never homeless again. But that's the overwhelming majority. There's this 10% that are chronically homeless, and the problem with them is that they're crazy. They're just plain old crazy. And yes, a lot of them are on drugs, and a lot of them are chronic drunks, but most of But the reason they're always on drugs and the reason they're always drunk is because they're crazy and they're trying to self-medicate. But they all have really severe mental problems. Choosing to live without a roof is, if that isn't the definition of crazy, I don't know what is. 3 things all humans need are food, clothing, and shelter. And anybody who chooses to do without one of those is crazy.
It's true. It's true.
So it's this 10%. And they're the chronically homeless. They are the people who are always homeless, except for when they wind up in jail or in the nut house or they're in the hospital or some relative manages to wrestle them back into the house, but they'll run out again as soon as they get a chance. We could do nothing. And lots of times there's nothing you can do. They don't want help, or they avoid help, or they don't know how to get help because they don't know what planet they're living on. But they cost us a fortune because they're constantly getting hurt, constantly, and they have to get taken to the emergency rooms. And of course, they don't have insurance, so we pay for it. We just wind up paying for it. And the chronically homeless, like the average chronically homeless person costs us literally hundreds of thousands of dollars
Yikes.
in medical bills. So we're just paying them a fortune. So to avoid that, to not have to do that, then again, if you're going to follow a strictly libertarian train of thought, what that would mean is you would have to give hospitals and doctors the right to refuse to service these people. And these hospitals and these doctors, they can't stand these people. You know, they're working with them all the time. Like I wrote about a woman who has emphysema, and every time she smokes a cigarette, she has to go to the emergency room. Well, guess what? She smokes a cigarette every single day.
Yep.
And then she goes to the emergency room every single goddamn day of her life. And every visit costs us tens of thousands of dollars. And of course, everybody tells her, you can't smoke. Do not smoke. And of course, and she tells everybody, okay, you're right, I won't smoke. And then she smokes because she's crazy.
Yep.
So what are you going to do? You know, when the folks at the homeless shelter, they tell me that, like, you know, she's choking to death. She's dying. She has no choice, but she has to be put on a hospital respirator. So so they call them up. They say, we've got an emergency here at the downtown homeless shelter, and the medics come, and they see her, and they're like swearing. They can't stand it. You know, it's like her again, her, every day. We're coming to pick her up every goddamn day. But they do not have the right to say no. They can't say no. They have to. And that's a really tough question that a lot of people, you know, and that ties into this whole healthcare business that we have is do doctors in the hospitals have the right to refuse to help somebody? Because Americans have become convinced that they don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it does. This brings
well, people will refer to the Hippocratic Oath. But the Hippocratic Oath, he didn't talk about people who are deliberately harming themselves every single day.
Right.
And that you have to make them all better at the expense of everybody else every single day. But people can't, nobody in this country will bring themselves, it's such a third rail, don't go there notion of refusing these people service, you know?
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our complete interview archive on our website, colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is comic artist Peter Bagge, author of the new collection of comic journalism, Everybody is Stupid Except for Me, and Other Astute Observations. It brings up quite an interesting issue about libertarianism in America, especially, that I think about every so often, which is that the libertarian positions, even the hard libertarian positions, do make sense when you spell them out. You can say, yeah, these bums are harming themselves, so all you have to do is take a more libertarian position, say they don't have to treat the bums, but then that's also a political non-starter. So the question, I guess, becomes, do you want America to become more libertarian? Because it's only going to get so libertarian, or do you, start your own libertarian country? Or I guess this is more of a debate at the center of libertarianism.
Right. Well, the thing, by refusing service to these people, they're going to die. But they're going to die anyway.
Right.
That's the problem. But it just goes against human nature to see somebody dying and do nothing. You know, even though that person is going to get out of the hospital and do the same thing immediately that put them in the hospital in the first place. They're going to do this. They're going to get really, really drunk, and they're going to walk in front of a truck all over again immediately, and not only put themselves in harm's way, but the truck driver. You know, they do a lot of harm not just to themselves, but to innocent bystanders. They're menaces.
Right.
So the one thing, this one solution that actually was a money saver was to let people to build homeless shelters, and at least with the chronic drunks who are the biggest danger to themselves and others, let them get drunk in the homeless shelter. But again, for moral reasons, that a lot of people, they can't stand that. A lot of people are like, no, they have to stop drinking. You know, they've got to stop drinking. But guess what? They won't. They never will. So a lot of these people, they have, you know, they want to be drunk all the time. 24 hours a day, they want to be drunk. They don't want to be sober for a single second. And people have tried many times. They've all been through, you know, detox. They've been through treatment. They've been through all of it. And as soon as they get out, they just want to get drunk immediately. And so at least if they're it's a bit experimental, but and I think the city is at least allowing it. I think that's all the city of Seattle is doing, is and they, I don't even know if they provided the building or not. I can't remember, but at least they amended the laws temporarily to allow these people to get drunk inside their homeless shelter. But other than that, in fact, Bill Gates and Paul Allen are paying for it, paying
Really?
for most of it.
That's a Seattle angle right there. They seem to pop up in a lot of projects, don't they?
Again, an awful lot of these charities that start up or that have been around forever, it's all about making the person who are running the charities and who are giving them money, it's all about making them feel good. And that's something else I found out covering the story about the homeless, is most people desperately want to help homeless children and homeless women. But there aren't nearly as many who are going to help the homeless men, because the homeless men are scary and creepy, you know, and then they seem threatening. But they're the ones that, you know, because there's far fewer people who are trying to get them off the street, they're the ones that get in a lot more trouble. So these, what they call bunks for drunks, it's still mostly men. But the Gates Foundation, their MO is very different from others, where it's like we don't want to make ourselves look good. We're not about making people who give us money feel good. We want to help. We want to solve this problem. So again, it's just to simply minimize the damage and the costs that these chronically homeless cause, that they're willing to try this as an experiment. And it's been a resounding success. Their trips to the hospital have been cut by like a tenth. You know, they still have to get taken to the hospital for kidney failure, you know, because they're drinking themselves to death.
Right.
You know, it's a building full of leaving Las Vegas, but they're no longer walking off of bridges and falling in manholes and all of that stuff. They're not getting concussions anymore.
I did find the bums piece fascinating also because it was not coverage of a specific event or necessarily a specific entity, unless you count the chronic 10%ers as an entity. And what was also fascinating is that the research process is revealed in that you draw yourself hanging out with bums and learning their valuable bum secrets and all that.
Right.
Which kind of I would be scared, but you were a braver man than I, clearly, and you did kind of learn how they live their lives. And what is refreshing is that you didn't take the angle, I met these bums, I learned about them, they're just like us, and therefore give them everything they want.
Yeah, well, what's the point in doing that? Well, again, it's such a knee-jerk position and it's a position that people take even if they start working with the homeless, get involved with them, at least at first, is they're just victims. They're victims of the system. And every person that I had a friend already who in the past had volunteered at the homeless shelter for years, and I also talked at length to the man who runs the downtown homeless shelter. He's been running it for decades now. And both of them went into it. They went into this field with high ideals, and they blamed Ronald Reagan for everything. But unless you're blind, they quickly learned this is not the case at all. There's no good guys and bad guys here. You know, it's just a mess. That's all it is, just a great big fat mess. It really has nothing to do with real estate values and all that kind of stuff, which people always seem to want to blame because they'll look at, like, Seattle's gotten very expensive. But when cities get very expensive, there's more wealth, and there's more wealth that's being shared, and then there's more facilities that help homeless. It's liberal cities, like San Francisco is the classic example, where, there's a lot of money there, but the reason the streets were so choked with homeless people is it wasn't because, it seems like it is. It seems like, they all got kicked out because the rents are so expensive. But no, they're not from San Francisco. If you can't afford a city, you move away. That's what happens. You don't just simply, if your apartment, the rents go through the roof and you get kicked out and every other apartment is beyond your means, you don't just simply stand there on the street. That's not what a sane person does. You go to where you can afford it. If you get to San Francisco, you move to San Jose. San Jose's too expensive, move to Stockton.
Right.
That's what sane people do because they want a roof over their heads. It's the crazies that stay outside. And in a city like San Francisco, those homeless people weren't from San Francisco. They were from everywhere else. And it's because San Francisco is so full of wealthy people and they donate so much money to soup kitchens and to shelters that they created a magnet. As like in that comic strip, as one young, otherwise very liberal, sensitive artist type said to me, even though I'm sure he voted for Obama and his vote's a straight Democratic ticket, the bums were making him sick, and he was the one that said, it's like we're throwing cheese all over your apartment and wondering why you have mice. It's like, of course the streets are choked with bums. It's like they were even just getting checks. You would register yourself as a homeless person, and they just hand you money. Now, what the hell do you think they spent that money on?
Yes, the explanation is right there at hand, it would seem.
But all these things were done so that wealthy liberal people would feel good, They'll think, well, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. It's the greedy landlords, It's the Republican administration, and here I'm trying, I'm going to help them by throwing money at them, which, of course, just exacerbates the problem.
I'm going to be bold here and generalize then part of the lesson to a lot of the other topics you cover in the book and in all these pieces is that, as with the homeless situation, there's a lot of blame being thrown around from party to party to party, a lot of villains being named, but there don't seem to be any actual villains in these situations. The war on drugs, there might be a different argument that there are some villains there. But Amtrak, why does Amtrak suck? Probably not a villain, probably systemic, right?
Yeah, and again, it exists because, like, this country was, to a large degree, was built on railroads, and it's so deep in the country psyche that people can't bring themselves to imagine that you can't get from one part of the country to another without being able to take the train, even if they never take it. Or people will even take it, have a horrible experience, but they still think it should exist. But the people who make the most noise is there are a lot of people, and it's mostly older men, much older men, they have a train fetish. It's something that I barely touched on in that comic strip, but they are they're fanatical. They are the noisiest proponents of Amtrak, and they go berserk every time a line is eliminated, or they're talking about reducing services. But they don't. These guys are retired. They don't need to get anywhere by Amtrak. They just simply love choo-choo trains. They're choo-choo train crazy. And it's their hobby, but they want you and me to pay for it. They want us to subsidize their hobby. They don't all have to be millionaires in order to cover the cost of operating it themselves.
It's somewhat astonishing that a group that one would imagine, at least I imagine, is small and somewhat generally ineffectual in matters political can bring that kind of a force to where something as expensive and large as Amtrak remains on life support for 30, 40 years.
That's the other thing, too, is that, one is just the romanticism of riding the train. And, again, people thinking, you can't possibly have it. And then there are parts of the country where, and it's the most populous parts of the country where Amtrak makes a profit. And it's because of the urban density that it makes sense. It's just like most of Europe is population-wise, it's very dense. So it even makes financial sense, as well as every other kind of sense, that you can take a train from London to Paris to Brussels to Hamburg, because there's an awful lot of people there. And so famously, it's the Northwest Corridor. If Amtrak went out of business, if they got rid of it tomorrow, in fact, there's a whole line of private companies that would snatch up that Northeast Corridor line in a second. And in fact, that's already happened in Southern California. The line between San Diego and Los Angeles always was profitable. And somebody did take it off of Amtrak's hands. Somebody else is running it, although originally that was an Amtrak line. And I would maybe not right now, but I could easily imagine a private line going from Vancouver, British Columbia, at least down to Portland, and that would make money too. But it's getting to Billings.
Yes.
And the people who are going from Boston to D.C., they can't. There's no way that they could subsidize what it costs to get somebody to Casper, Wyoming, or even to Denver. It's just you have these huge long stretches of land, and you're just passing town after town where nobody wants to take the train. I took it from the train in that strip. I took it from Seattle to Los Angeles, and that, for the most part, it's connecting a lot of very big cities. But there still were lots of small towns where hardly anybody got off, or possibly even nobody got off. And the line, that's the other thing too, is those rail lines aren't owned by the government. They're owned by Pacific Northern and Santa Fe or whatever conglomerations are left that run freight. And, of course, running freight makes them money. And that's always been the case with the railroads. But never in history, never in the history of America has it been profitable to ship passengers through the barren West. The whole western part of except for maybe San Francisco, between San Francisco and San Diego, it would be profitable. But through most of the country, it's always been a money loser. So going all the way back to like the 1900s, the federal government has always forced the private freight lines to allow passenger trains. And Amtrak is basically just an extension of that. It's just that they used to be, the railroads themselves were private lines. But the people who are just shipping coal and lumber, they've always hated these passenger trains.
Yeah, and I've had the experience on Amtrak of just pulling, it's not pulling over that they do, but just moving off the main track over and over and over and over
right.
again to let more freight pass.
Well, here's another thing of the government just simply not doing what it's supposed to do. That was the overwhelming reason why Amtrak is always late on these long runs. The passenger train is supposed to have the right of way, but they don't. The private companies are always making the passenger trains wait while the freight train goes through. It's supposed to be the opposite, but the federal government won't enforce that rule. I guess because they take bribes from Pacific Northern. They simply don't enforce it. It's ridiculous. But the other thing too. The other reason that the freight companies can't stand the passenger trains is the tracks are in awful shape. That's another thing you may have noticed when you're going through the boonies and you're going through the,
yes.
The Sierra Mountains or whatever. Is it's really rickety and wobbly and screechy, and the tracks are just a mess. And they're not meant for humans to be riding on. It's very uncomfortable. But logs and coal don't complain.
True enough.
And if a freight car tips over and coal goes falling down a cliff, the coal doesn't sue.
Yes, and another good point.
It's like, oh well, we lost a carload of coal. Big deal. But it's like they lose a fortune if they get sued up the wazoo if a passenger train tips over.
In that piece and in the other pieces in the book, you do seem to take some joy in examining and dissecting the nonsensical arguments that are made for a lot of things governmental. And I do have to ask you this, considering it's a newer issue in a way than any of the pieces in the book, but I've found that the national health care debate has been sort of horrendously nonsensical in most quarters that it's being discussed and argued and shouted about. Have you found the same?
It's a mess. And again, that's another issue, just like with the homeless, it's another issue where I myself don't have any simple, easy answers. I barely know where to begin to solve this mess because we started down this road a long time ago. And we'd have to go all the way back to the beginning. Again,
yes.
like what I was talking about can hospitals and doctors refuse to offer service to homeless people? Can they do that to anybody? You know what I mean? Because right now they can't. And that's what's creating this problem. Americans believe that they are entitled to an unlimited supply of health services, but there isn't an unlimited supply. Nobody is applying the laws of supply and demand to health care, but you have to. And that's something that nobody is talking about. It seems like if we're going to continue down the road that we've already started, that we're going to wind up with single-payer national health system, just like they have in a lot of other countries. But that will mean rationing. There's no way that it couldn't. Obama is either incredibly ignorant or he's lying when he says that there won't be rationing. There has to be. There will simply have to be. You know, if people would think that they're entitled to everything that they want, because you can't. We can't all have a CAT scan every single day. You got to say no to somebody at some point.
Then this is not a way of thinking that seems to translate for people into other areas. People don't demand as much food as they can eat all the time, even if they can't pay for it. They don't demand to have a fleet of cars. Why is it, do you think, this one sector where they think, just bring it on? It's all...
Well, it's because this somebody that I'd love to go back in time and strangle said that healthcare is a right. And that sure sounds nice. Everybody likes the way that sounds. And, if you repeat something often enough, it's true. But healthcare isn't a right. But what do you do when everybody believes it is? And right now, everybody believes that healthcare is a right, that they're entitled to it. And that's just simply impossible. That's exactly the same. That is absurd as saying that bacon is a right. Yeah, or a Rolls Royce is a right. It's just absurd. It's a service. It's a product. The debate is like idiotic right on its face if you're going to assume that at all. But what would happen even if you're the most rock-hard conservative politician? Who's going to say that it isn't? Who's going to get up there on TV and say what I just said? That's why there's no libertarian politicians getting elected. It's because nobody could stomach hearing that.
Nice.
People love the warm and fuzzies. They don't think about what this stuff means. How these notions manifest themselves and where it leads. It just sounds good. People just get so married to these warm and fuzzy notions, and then to tell them, sorry, but you can't have cotton candy before you go to bed. They just have a temper tantrum.
I'm beginning to suspect these good feelings people want is this kind of a fountain of a lot of the world's ills now.
Well, yeah, it is in this country, and we just don't have the money to pay for it. All these solutions, the solutions that always seem to get the most traction are the ones that cost money. It's so, like the cash for clunkers, it's so hilarious that politicians are like, we got to keep this going. It's really popular. Of course it's popular. You're giving away money. You're just giving away free money.
That's always going to be popular.
Everybody loves it. Of course they want more, But they think they've hit on some secret formula, Well, what they're doing is just buying votes. They're buying votes with money that nobody has. It's insanity.
Oh, well, yeah, on that delightful note, where has the time gone? The book, once again, is Everybody is Stupid Except for Me and Other Astute Observations. Peter Bagge, thanks so much again for coming back on the program.
Sure, thank you very much.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can hear our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com, and if you have any feedback, please direct it to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. You can find the website of our theme music producer, Ben Althouse, at benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.